And now is the Collaborative Innovation virtual book launch with Dr. Bart Bartholomew.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome back to the afternoon session for Impact Week. We've got today Dr. Bart Bartholomew, who's going to introduce his newly published book, Collaborative Innovation. So welcome to our virtual book launch.
Thank you.
Well, tell us about the book, Bart.
Well, I wrote the book for two reasons, and then a third one showed up, okay? I've been at Wright Brothers Institute since the beginning, 20 years, and I thought it was time for us to put together in one space all of the cool things that the Wright Brothers Institute, the men and women of WBI, and the Air Force Research Lab have done over that time period, mostly in collaboration and innovation. So it took me a while to amass the stories. And if anybody knows me, they know I'm a storyteller. So the book is really 50 stories about what has happened in that 20-year period between 2000 essentially and today around innovation and collaboration where Wright Brothers Institute worked with the Air Force Research Lab. That was the first reason. The second reason is that I had a gut feeling that if I looked at that 20-year period, something new would pop out. I have a good friend, Ryan Kramer, who actually looks at data and looks at sort of the height of the data. And every once in a while, something pops that you don't see if you just look at the page. And I knew that if I could get all these stories laid out in some sort of a storyboard fashion, something new might pop out. And sure enough, it did. It was collaborative innovation. It was something neither collaborative nor innovative, but both. And when I saw that, the book changed a little bit to one which described collaborative innovation. And that's why the title is Collaborative Innovation as opposed to WBI. The third reason was that I started the book in December of 2019. And about 2 months later, the COVID activity hit. And they kept talking about these old people. You know, old people are really vulnerable. And I thought, who are those old people? And I thought, maybe it's me. Maybe I get this book done before something bad happens. So I'm going to be 80 next month. And so I hustled and wrote the book, and the book came out about mid-year. So that's how it all started.
Fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about the organization that has helped you launch the book and how they've informed some of the choices you've made across your career?
Oh, absolutely. Well, there's really only been two. Actually, I've got a 60-year career, but it's always around the Air Force. So my first 35 years, I came in as a rocket scientist and actually did some rocket scientry. This was the Cold War, so it was a lot of fun. And I stayed because it was the greatest place in the world. I could have gone anyplace else, I think, at various times, but there was no better place to do really advanced research and cool stuff, innovative things than the Air Force. And so I stayed for 35 years. And I retired from that job in 1995, and then I consulted for about 5 years. And then all of a sudden, the people that were inside the Air Force Research Lab wanted an organization outside to help them with collaboration and innovation. That was what our first job was. Now we do commercialization and other things, but so I thought, why not? So we started this, and one thing led to the other, and now the organization's almost 50 people big and hundreds of millions of dollars over a 5-year period. So I never left Dayton, Ohio. Maybe that's maybe I shouldn't have gone anyplace else, but I stayed in Dayton. I stayed as close to the Air Force as could be, within like 3 miles of the Air Force for 60 years. But I've had dozens of jobs and loads of fun, and I want to change one thing. So it's probably to some people like, why didn't he go someplace? But why did I have to go someplace? It was so fun, so much fun where I was.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about what it was like when you were first given that opportunity to find that space outside of the fence.
Yeah.
What were some of the collaboration and innovation goals at the time? Was it about moving technology, or was it about bringing people in? What were some of the goals?
Well, probably more technology at the time, because what had happened in around the year 2000, besides 9/11 and everything else, was there was a real realization that the technologies that we were relying on to fight the Cold War, which I think we were successful with, there was no Third World War, were changing. It was changing to the internet. It was changing to communication systems that we had never dealt with before. Even the Air Force today is struggling with how do you incorporate all of these kind of new conditions in the Air Force armament activity. And then biowarfare and cyberny with chemical, bio, radiological. We were beginning to fight in the Middle East, or that followed almost immediately after the Cold War ended. And so there were lots of new technologies that we hadn't become expert on. And so the job of WBI at the time, and again, we were very small, was could we connect the people on the inside of the fence, so to speak, of the inside of the Air Force Research Lab with some of the groundbreakers on the outside. So we did just that. And, we connected eventually with Google and Facebook and all of the Apple. And that was our job for most of the first 10 years. But in the last 10 years, it's been more around, can we stimulate small businesses and large businesses to do what the Air Force needs? And can we do it in a fair way by collaborating with these folks first and then focusing them on what the Defense Department and the Air Force really needs? So we've changed somewhat, but we haven't given up the collaboration and the innovation. We just added what we now call commercialization and small business development to our repertoire, and we got bigger in the process of doing it.
Sure. And I would imagine in those early days that it was probably quite the culture shift. And I think some of the things we heard earlier today really point to that culture shift as well, partnering outside of sort of those known networks and outside of the fence. What was the reaction to that workforce in terms of how they would collaborate? How did they react to WBI and that whole change?
Yep. Well, the thing I think that made the biggest difference in the first year is we actually created a space called the Collaboratory. It was just one room, a big room, where people from the Air Force Research Lab could come. And at first they were reluctant to come. They didn't know what was going to happen there. But, I'm sort of a facilitator, and I tried to help that happen. And here's the interesting thing. Once they came, they wanted to come back because they could talk freely. They could come back in the evenings. I remember one executive director of AFRL, whose name I won't mention, used to sneak out at times and hang out with us just so he wasn't bothered with the bureaucracy. And when people found out he was coming out, guess what? They came out too. We had these great conversations, and then we introduced snacks and beer and stuff like that. So the collaboration became much more exciting, and folks began to talk to each other across the boundaries of the Air Force Research Lab. They are all, sort of stovepipe, but when they were in our facility, they could talk to each other, and they found cool things to work on and innovation. And we ended up replicating that one room with 20 rooms in our new facility, but we used the same ideas, a lot of flexibility. Today, that's taken for granted, with the virtual world that we're now living in. But in those days, 20 years ago, the ability to come and talk and record and be free of wires and all that stuff was very unique. And even though that isn't probably the most important thing we did, it was the physical thing that we did in our environments. Now we have 3 environments and probably more coming, are really hospitable to talk about important things that are important to the Air Force and the Air Force Research Lab. So that was, I think, the big thing that happened then. And of course, we incorporated visuals and computers and internets into our systems too. But I think that's why the book was interesting, because as I went back 20 years, I had forgotten most of the things that had really happened. I thought, son of a gun, that's an interesting thing that occurred there.
Yeah, it's interesting to evaluate what changes occurred and what are still kind of there.
Yep.
Some of the issues are still there, and some of them have gotten a lot easier or have been dealt with. What would you say was the reaction to the workforce in terms of, does the hierarchy somewhat disappear in that kind of environment when people are collaborating? Does it become more of an even playing field?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, that was pretty obvious in the first couple of years, where you could have the executive director who's like 4 layers above an engineer who's down here, or a technician, hanging out after work or during hours, because after a while we said, let's do these things all the time. And they, somebody would say something, he would say, oh, that's interesting. We had whiteboards. That was a new innovation in those days, and you could write anything you wanted on the whiteboard. We had movable furniture, we had recording systems, and so it became really a kind of a professional place, but with the collaborative nature of a tavern or so, you know, I mean, that's the way I think about it. Now, what really was a breakthrough, and I saw that when I was writing the book, was when we began to bring in people not from the Air Force Research Lab, people who didn't even look like they should be talking to people in the Air Force Research Lab. Like, you know, we would bring in robotic surgeons, or we would bring in artists, or we would bring in people that had a connection with what the folks in the lab was doing, but it was a connection that they never took advantage of because it didn't look like something that would work. Once we brought those people in, then that collaboration really clicked, and we were able to stop trying to solve problems and look at the problem itself. And that was a real breakthrough. The idea, Einstein said two things, and I just talked about both of them. Einstein, he said more than two things, but two things that everybody, I think, knows about him. One is he said, if I had 60 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes in the problem space. And that became our mantra. As soon as somebody raised their hand and said, I've got the solution, went, no, hold off, hold back, let's examine the problem. And the other thing he said, and I won't use exactly the right words, he said, it's hard to solve a really tough problem from the same perspective, point of view that the problem was defined. So if you bring in an anthropologist and an artist and an NFL coach, you're going to get a totally different perspective on a problem that's very Air Force-y. And I've got a whole story around that one. So that was one of the big breakthroughs for me as I was writing the book, because as you write a book, you write kind of linearly. But every once in a while, this thing would pop out, and I kept calling it collaborative innovation because it was the mixture of those two approaches. And I thought, there is something called collaborative innovation. It isn't just some collaboration, some innovation. There's something new. There's something special that happens when you collaborate and then you innovate. So that's how the book got formed, but that's also how Wright Brothers Institute kind of proceeded from the early days to now.
Right. So two things sort of stood out about what you just said, which is one, the effect that physical space has for people in order to bring that collaborative innovation to life. And then two, how you take an idea like bringing in a robotic surgeon and actually sell that to the Air Force as a way of solving a problem. So how do you feel like those two things fit together? Do you have to have both of those components?
I think so. Before Wright Brothers Institute got formed, I took a couple of trips. I went to the Santa Fe Institute, where they bring in Nobel laureates, and they put them in their little offices, very plush offices and all of that. And they were hoping these guys would talk to each other. They didn't. But they said, well, let's make them talk to each other. Let's have this great breakfast right in the middle of the morning and a great wine and cheese party in the afternoon. And of course, they came out for that, and they started talking. All kinds of cool stuff started to happen. So you're right. The environment does make a difference. So if you go into the base and you look at all these big buildings there, it's really, hard for people to get around. And once you go in your office, you don't want to leave anyways, okay? Now, the other thing is that the acceptance of people that you are not normally engaging with, like artists, and really came about. This is another little story. I was in a bar with a guy named Peter Benkendorf, who is a part of the Dayton community. And he says, I got a whole bunch of artists that would love to talk to people at the base. And I go, well, maybe I can help. And it so happens that my daughter, who's a PhD in human factors engineering, was interested in visualization of data for pilots. She's a cockpit developer. And she says, how can we get better visualization so the pilots can understand that data very, very quickly? And I says, I got a deal for you. How about if you bring your gang, and Peter will bring his gang of artists to the environment that we had created at WBI. And there's a funny story that goes along with it, because I said, Peter, we got to set up the environment so there'll be a lot of communications and stuff. So we set up the table in an L shape. Peter and I were in the front, and all the spaces on each side were open. We opened the door, and the first engineer came in with his computer, and he sat on one side. The second engineer came in with a computer and sat on the other side. They were all dressed up. They had suits and ties. So that whole side was taken up by the engineers, okay? Then the artists came in, and by artists, we were talking about choreographers, dancers, musicians, all kinds of people. They all sat on the other side, and they're all looking at each other. All the artists had brought in a piece of their art, so it was a video or something like that. I said, Peter, I think we're in trouble. But all of a sudden they started telling what they did. And it was formal at first, like, okay, you tell it for 5 minutes. And that took about an hour, and we left and we took a break. And when we came back, all of the places had changed. They were all talking to each other.
Interesting.
So at first, anybody would have said, why are you bringing artists into the base? But once they began seeing the potential of artists, or we even had the choreographer looking at UAVs that would be flying around downtown Dayton in a choreographic way. So it takes a little bit of, I don't know, openness, courage, whatever, to take that first step. I hate to use this example, but it's the first time you meet somebody that you really like. I mean, it takes that little courage to go up and say, hi, I'm so-and-so. Once that happens, you're absolutely right. It doesn't happen naturally. So we figured this out, and we did 25 of those after that first one over about a 5-year period. And we set it up right. We even used speed dating. We'd have, we would have the 10 artists, they weren't all artists now afterwards, and 10 of the scientists and engineers talk to each other for 2 minutes and then move on, talk to somebody else. We couldn't get them to stop talking after a while. I mean, once you open that aperture, so to speak, but it isn't natural, it isn't the first time. But so, yeah, there was some humps to get over at the beginning.
Well, and I think it's really interesting that it started with sort of a chance encounter of someone mentioning how interesting that would be to get the same people in the same room, and then it was developed into a process.
Yes.
And that's divergent collaboration,
Absolutely, yeah. Divergent collaboration, which is another word for collaborative innovation. And it's really 2 parts, but they're not the way you would think they would be. You collaborate first, and then you innovate. I think most of us, when we have a problem and we're trying to get some innovation, we bring the experts in. Okay, oh, this problem is tough, and yeah, but it's an electrical problem, so I think I'll bring in a whole bunch of electrical engineers, okay? And they will give you an electrical engineering solution, which may not be the right thing. So if you collaborate first, and you don't even tell them the problem, we bring these people in, we keep them in suspense for a day. So here's an interesting problem that we did one of our first ones on. Everybody knows about drones, and I think most people now realize that most of the pilots in the Air Force never get in the plane. They're at a desk, they have a computer screen, they're flying these drones, and it's not easy. Sometimes they have to fly 5 drones, and they have to look at sensors, and sometimes they have weapons on them. And by the way, they're in Albuquerque, and the drones are in Afghanistan, and there's a lot of life and death issues. That's a tough problem. What kind of a person is best suited to do that? What kind of a screen is best suited, just like you would pick one for your children? What kind of rep rate do you need? How do you get the feedback and all of that? So that was a big problem. What kind of people are best suited to be those kind of pilots, and how can we improve their performance? So we thought about it for a while. We thought, well, who does stuff like that, but not for the Air Force? So the robotic surgeon does that. I actually witnessed the robotic surgery where I was in one room and the patient was way over there, and this guy is cutting and catheterizing and all of that. And he says, the body is my battlefield. The battlefield is where the Air Force pilots have to operate with precision strike and situational awareness. Matter of fact, the doctor said that, and I thought, those are exactly the 2 terms that Air Force pilot used. Those 2 are very famous. Then so he was one of 12. Another one that was kind of fascinating, we found this young woman. She was 20 years old. She had joined the Peace Corps at 18. She had gone to Africa and lived in a tribe that had absolutely no automation whatsoever, 0. I mean, these people still rub sticks to start fires, and they hunted to eat. And we put her in a 2-person group with the robotic surgeon. So here you got a guy 60 years old that has done everything in the world. And they had this great conversation about how hard it was for people to get accustomed to this kind of like, off-base type of stuff. And that led to something really cool. Then we brought in an anthropologist, and we said, how did early man, figure out how to communicate and do things? We brought in an NFL coach, and he said, everything is about before the game. The game is just sort of like the end point. That's why you don't see these coaches getting too excited sometimes during the game, because it's either all played out or, it's not going to work. So we had an NFL coach, a 20-year-old who, was kind of like oblivious to the world of robotic surgery. And we also had an anthropologist, as I mentioned before, and also a gamer. So now gamers, you would think, would be exactly what you want the Air Force pilots to be. As a matter of fact, to this day, I think at the Air Force Academy, they kind of look for potential
Right.
people who are really good, with hand-eye coordination. Our grandchildren are sort of that way. Uh, but they can't be wild and crazy like gamers, because gamers kill each other and shoot each other. They make terrible mistakes. So that has to be incorporated into, how these people can use those skills. So that's a perfect example of collaborating first, getting those people kind of comfortable with each other, then throwing the problem after the first half of the day. Oh, then we broke them up into teams. And so the net result of that, I can't remember every single thing that came out of it, was that, and this is so obvious, but sometimes problems are obvious. The people that actually are those pilots are about 25 to 30 years old. The people that build those systems are 40 to 55 years old. And the generals who are commanding the whole thing are even older. And the students that you really like to get that zip in, the STEM students, they're 15 years old. How do you get all of those people to help each other out in the training program? So I always thought that was a perfect example of collaborative innovation. I know we call it divergent collaboration. The divergent really means you're bringing in people that you'd never expect to be in the same room, but they feed off each other, and their perspective. I think the big problem with most people is when somebody comes at you with a different perspective than yours, the natural reaction is protection. I think our brains were built to stave off people that might hurt us, but listen to them and you think, wow, that's interesting. So we've had 25 of those for all kinds of reasons, and they're collaborative innovation examples. There are others too, but those are them.
Sure. And I think too, what's interesting about that process is, like you're talking about self-protection, is how do you let your ego go enough?
Exactly.
Right? Because especially with people that are, very science and technology oriented, they don't like to feel inept, right?
Yeah.
Nobody likes to feel
Right.
inept, but they especially don't. So what would you say is the key factor for getting those people to drop those egos and engage?
Yeah, well, that's part of the facilitation activity, and my job is really to loosen them up. I remember when I went to Germany, the smartest people in the world were called here, doctor, professor, and believe me, that guy's not going to say, oh, I don't know how to solve this problem, and that's pretty much the same way as it is in the United States. So we do a lot of things like speed dating. I mean, believe me, some of the people from the Air Force Research Lab that are way up there thought, what do you mean speed dating? Why do I have to talk to this person? But give it a try, give it a shot, and we bring them there, and they know we're going to be doing, innovative stuff and collaborative stuff. So they're not quite sure what's going to happen, but they're kind of ready for it. And then we orchestrate the 2 days very carefully. So, because if you give them the problem they'll try to solve that. They don't care about these other people. So collaboration comes first. You're right. The most expert person is the worst person for innovation, because they know the answer already. So they need to be there was a book out, a whack on the side of the face. They need a whack on the side of the face, not literally, to kind of open up their perspective. And since we've been doing that, I look for that in anybody. I say, are you open to maybe discussing this with people that you? And now it's a cool thing to do, and I think we're doing more of that.
So we had a question from the audience. Have any collaborations come with innovations that were totally unexpected?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We've had collaborations where what we thought was the problem wasn't the problem at all. And those are the most interesting ones, okay? Because here's this team that's been assembled very carefully to solve a particular problem. And after a whole bunch of discussion, they go, oh my God, that's not the problem at all, okay? And a perfect example is one about workforce development, okay? Workforce development is a giant, I know there's a bunch of impact activities on that alone. And so you would say, how are we going to get the workforce of the future for the Air Force? Well, the traditional way is that we watch for the colleges. We see what kind of engineering people are there. Or we go to the Air Force Academy. We send them there. We train them for years. Okay, and then they get their first assignment, and they go, "Oh, you're going to do this." That's not the way the world is today. And what we found out in one of these is that you better discard that approach, because believe me, you may get somebody because you're paying their way through college, and of course that sounds good, but they're gone. So one of the things that came out in one of our workshops was, why don't we make it much more agile, much more open to different kinds of. I came in 60 years ago with the promise that I would be there for 35 years and I would have a reasonable salary, not the best one. I didn't really stay because of that reason, but that was the promise. Now, if you offer an MIT grad that possibility, you go, 35 years, I don't want to be there for 35 years. I want to go 2 years to find out all the cool stuff and leave. So one of our unusual innovations came out in a workforce development activity where we were bringing in people who had to be very, very innovative, not in the world of science and engineering, like a card company who had somebody who was the head of a Hallmark cards. Mm-hmm. And they would go, we just keep people for 2 years, and then they go off and they come back. So we thought, gosh, we've been so stuck in our old ways of thinking. So I think that's an interesting example of an innovation that came out without us realizing it. And we did have somebody who designed cards, greeting cards. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you've ever seen the process of a greeting card, but they have poets and they have artists, and now there's little songs, and so you need little miniature, voice things and all of that. And they were telling us what they did. And in the Air Force Research Lab, people said, we need some of that stuff too. But yet it's hard to cross. It's a paradigm.
Right.
It's a paradigm that has to be crossed. Yep.
Well, we've got some time left, so I would love to give you the opportunity to read a couple of pieces of your book.
Okay.
Whichever you'd like to choose would be great.
Well, I'll tell you, if I buy a book like this, and believe me, I bought hundreds of them, okay, I only look at the first paragraph, okay? Now, if the first paragraph is kind of grabbing, then I will continue with the book. But if the first paragraph tells me all about the structure of the book, I'm bored. So what I did when I wrote this book is I didn't put any introduction in initially. And I finished the book. And the book, as I've been saying, ends up saying collaborative innovation is a brand new process, and it can really do some unbelievable things. So I lifted that back paragraph and I put it in the front. So if you open up the book after the pages, I'll just read that because I think I can also tell a couple of stories. Collaborative innovation can produce powerful results and move teams and organizations from breakdowns to breakthroughs. Every team wants collaboration, and every organization wants innovation. Yet there are thousands of books, seminars, articles produced each year that focus on how to help you achieve those particular capabilities. So combining the two should even be harder. Nope, surprisingly not. What we found is that innovation needs collaboration, and that collaboration needs innovation. They're intertwined, and often they haven't been twined at all. Although we started to explore both separately, and half of the book is about how we explored it separately, and they're interesting in themselves because you might want just collaboration or you just might want innovation. Actually, both are necessary if you really want to achieve transformation results and new breakthroughs. This book captures some of the steps and paths that the Wright Brothers Institute took with its partner, the Air Force Research Lab, on its journey to collaborative innovation. It certainly focuses on best practices that we found, but the book also describes some of the reasons that we learned and miscues that we made, okay? Everything didn't turn out great. There were loud arguments sometimes in our little workshops. The good news is that the reader doesn't have to repeat everything that we did to achieve collaborative innovation. There are practices and principles that will be discussed that can be used to stimulate, facilitate, support, sustain collaborative innovation. But don't be fooled. It will take effort and commitment. Collaborative innovation is both an art and a science. And it's mostly about people and how they behave and when they really collaborate and innovate. So that's all I'll read. And hopefully, if you read that, one of two things will have you say, I'm not interested in that at all. Or you might go, oh, that's interesting. I always thought they were two separate things. And then I won't read it, but I'll just quickly say what it is. The back of the book, the whole last section, is about what any organization, team, or even person can do to get there. And there's only 6 principles that and you'll be surprised at these 6 principles. One is to tell it from your soul. We always talk about speak from your soul, speak for what you really want to get out. Most people don't do that. Most conversations are trivial. And even in the most refined situations, people go, oh yeah, that's good. And they fly off. Now, you don't have to be serious all the time, but like, this is what I really want. I mean, this is what I want, and I'm not going to take any left. The second one, which we all heard about, is listen with passion, listen with heart, hear from the heart. I kind of coined those two terms: speak from the soul, hear from the heart. And by hearing from the heart, it's like, listen generously. Listen to this person. You don't know them. They may not really fit the bill, but listen to them. The third one is curiosity. Now, I think some people believe that you're born with curiosity, and clearly some people are more curious than others. But you can develop curiosity. Okay, you can facilitate curiosity. And I firmly believe that if you really want collaborative innovation, go find somebody who can help you get it, a facilitator. I know that term is probably unfamiliar to people, but it's somebody that in the meeting can make sure you don't go over the edge. And you and I, Jenny, have been facilitators in many, many meetings. Sometimes the apples get thrown at us because we are kind of harsh, but it really helps. So curiosity is something, you can keep asking questions. Be adaptable. I mean, if you're set and this is the way it's going to be, nothing much is really going to change. The fifth one is mutuality. I mean, you need some respect. I don't care if it's an 18-year-old student or a 55-year-old rocket scientist. Be respectful. And I know these all sound so common. Like, of course I'm respectful. Of course I listen. And the last one, which I think is really fascinating, is watch the energy. And when the energy starts gravitating the other way, pull it back. Now, if you're the leader, you can maybe do that by banging on the table. But sometimes the leader can't do that for whatever reason, or there's no leader. And I think it's up to all of us to say, hey, guys, we're off. I mean, you've seen this in meetings. We're off on some rabbit trail over here. Nothing's going to happen. So mutuality, energy awareness, curiosity, adaptability. And the two I love the best, and Jenny, I have a talking stick that I got from an ancient Indian tribe, and the talking stick only has two rules, and I've used it with presidents and generals and Slovakian tyrants. If you hold the talking stick, you have to tell the truth. You have to speak from the soul. If you listen as the talking stick is being used, you should listen hearing from the heart. You should be open to what that guy's saying. It's worked. That's how we got the setting for the Holbrook Dayton Peace Accord set up.
That's right. So I think we have time for one more question. Someone asked, what's your favorite memory at WBI?
My favorite memory, it's so hard. My favorite memory, I think, though, is that we finally decided that we weren't collaborating enough, okay? And so we had various directors. I was the first director, but then I thought, I don't want to be a director anymore. I want to have fun. I want to hang out with Jenny and have good times. And so we instituted the social aspect of it. And we've actually woven that into our workshops and the work that we do. Now, I'm not trying to trivialize the social, saying, oh, come on over, we'll get you a glass of wine. But there has to be, it's just like just before you fall asleep, okay? When you got this problem and then finally, eventually you fall asleep. And there's that moment where nothing really matters and there's an opportunity for a possibility. Something squeaks out of that little time. And if you can wake up right away, you write it down. So I do think the environment's important. The facilitation's important too. And if you want to look at the socialization aspect, so the speed dating is not something that you would expect right next to an Air Force base, okay? And we're not trying to get coupling here over here. We're just trying to get people to talk to each other. And I think when that began to happen, and we've had some great times and we've had some great wine parties, and this facility is a perfect example of it. 444 is the kind of place where when you walk in, you think, oh, this is going to be fun. You don't even know what's going to happen, but this is going to be fun. So even though I'm a scientist and an engineer and, hopefully an executive that help teams, those are important things, but it's the middle stuff. It's the seams that really count. And if you talk to people from Apple, not Steve Jobs anymore, but he really moved Apple forward by combining environment, some really sharp, different people, and making it fun. I remember the movie of the Macintosh where these people were giggling and, doing cool stuff and no wine, but it was the same type of a thing,
Yeah.
So I know that's probably surprising that that's the most important thing that I remember, but it's in there too. So don't negate that. Don't lose that.
Fantastic. And anyone who's interested in getting a signed copy of Bart's book, please check out his speaker profile. You can order a copy there. We're also offering contactless pickup. So at 444 East 2nd Street in Dayton, you can pick up in our vestibule a signed copy from Bart. We've also got some signed copies at our Springfield Street location. So thank you so much for participating. We're thrilled for your book. And thank you again for coming to Air and Industry Impact Week.
Right. And thank you for this exposure. Very good.